Hi, how you doing? Welcome to the latest episode of the Wellbeing Show. I've got Dr. Katherine Hall with me, who's an assistant professor at Coventry University, and we're going to be talking about psychology and the research she's been working on, which is a very hot topic about screen time with kids. And so we're going to be talking about some of that stuff. Before we get into it, just to let you all know, although it looks live and we record it in one shot, both myself and Kat, when this goes out, will be doing social stuff. So certainly don't call me. I'm going to give you my number. If you call me, you might get a grumpy old man response as opposed to something pleasant. But do send me messages, WhatsApp me, and certainly I don't know if Kat will give you contact details like an email or stuff, but certainly if you've got questions for her, send them to me and I'll pass them on to her and get responses. It'd be great if you subscribe to the video if you're watching it on YouTube, or like it, add some comments. I really, really appreciate your feedback. It not just helps my algorithm, as my team keep telling me, but actually I find it really interesting to hear what you think is interesting. And if you've got questions and comments for Kat, I'm certainly happy to pass them on. I'm sure she'd be delighted to field questions as well. That said, that's enough from me. Kat, welcome to the Wellbeing Show. It's good to have you here.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's great. I mean, we were talking before the show. I mean, I sort of know about Coventry's background in research and psychological science. Goes back a long time. I remember, I think it might have been Sheffield Bell was at, but certainly Coventry is, I mean, right up there in terms of my understanding of psychological research and the science behind the psychology that people might meet through their doctor with CBT or something like that, which is generally tends to be how people experience psychology these days. Is that would be the first one, and it's great that you're here, and very much support the idea of getting the research out to people. So, are you from Coventry? Did I detect a sort of Midlands accent somewhere there, or?
Yes, I'm from the Midlands. Yeah,
Okay.
so I grew up technically on the border, I'd say, between sort of like Warwickshire and Leicestershire. So I grew up in a small village, and it was one of those kind of cases that we had like a Leicestershire phone number, but a Warwickshire postcode, and
Right.
we are pretty much, right, sort of Battle of Bosworth kind of area, sort of like the debated proper centre of England rather than it being Meriden or something. So around there, but yeah, not far. And I'm currently sort of about maybe 20-25 minutes drive away from Coventry, and I kind of commute in.
Yeah, Coventry has that amazing cathedral with a very sad story behind it, of course. But it was an amazing sort of phoenix-like resurrection from the very awful bombing that took place in Coventry. Since I'm from Birmingham myself, although I don't really sound like it, but that's where I grew up in the Black Country. So uh,
Yeah.
we're both from the Black Country and we know it well, right? All of this sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, so and my dad's side of the family also sort of from Coventry. So yeah, I've heard many kind of stories over the year about sort of my grandparents being kind of as they were growing up, I think the bombs literally stopped at the very end of their street, and kind of they lived sort of on the same street growing up as kids. And
Yeah.
obviously I wouldn't be here today if it had changed. But yeah, it's definitely a central part of Coventry, and it's a big part of kind of I think our message of the university as well. We very much kind of embody that sort of phoenix and that kind of sort of we very inclusive in our teaching, and kind of sort of we're all about sort of widening participation and kind of helping people sort of get to where they want to be. So we definitely embody that kind of whole Coventry message, I would say. It's a big part
Yeah.
of us.
And I think the university has been very clear in its public communications about presenting research and engaging and sharing. I was saying to you before the show started, before we started recording, I've had other colleagues from the university on. A professor of nursing, psychiatric nursing, was on, and we had a good old chinwag about my days when I was working in wards and I used to rely on my life for the nursing staff, to be honest. Sort of like the first people you'd make friends with because they would rescue you in the event of something kicking off. So we had a really good chat. But it's great to see a really clear research base, but also public communication and public information space. And how did you, I mean, you grew up in that sort of area. Did you know from an early age that you were into psychology? That was like or was it something you stumbled into later? I mean, it was, so tell us, like school and stuff like that. Were you always interested in how the mind worked or something?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So I think a lot of us psychologists, we all sort of joke that we kind of probably have come from a very personal place to sort of want to pursue psychology in the first instance. So
Sure.
it's either that we've kind of had exposure to it, maybe we've had our own kind of like personal challenges, or we know somebody maybe that's needed support with their sort of well-being and their mental health. I think for me, I always knew I wanted to, I think, work in a profession where I connected with people. So I think I've always had a very kind of strong sort of empathetic kind of, I suppose, sort of like skill base, probably sometimes to my detriment. My partner would probably say sometimes too
Right.
much, too empathetic, especially with
Okay.
our 7-year-old maybe. Um, kind of very permissive parenting probably sort of going on. But
That's
yeah,
fine.
so
That's just the nature of parenting, mate.
well, it's like it's
You're
good cop,
always
bad
going to
cop,
lose
isn't it?
against a 7-year-old, I'm afraid.
Yes, definitely.
One just has to accept reality.
Yes. But yeah, no, so I always knew that I wanted to do something where I think I was almost kind of, I suppose, in a way, practicing those sort of mind reading skills that is always that kind of trope that, oh, you're a psychologist, you're a mind reader. But I think to begin with, that's very much, I thought of myself as someone who was able to
Yeah.
understand other people's, mental representations and their unique kind of experiences. And I thought if I had this innate kind of empathetic skill, then the job to do to put that into practice was to become a psychologist. So I think to start with, I kind of started like many of our sort of graduates do. Or our students kind of wanting to go into sort of clinical or counselling psychology,
Right.
because essentially a lot of our students have in mind this idea that they're going to kind of go into sort of like a chartered kind of psychologist role, and that they're going to be doing kind of like the talking therapies and or doing like a profession similar to yourself. And I think that was always the goal, but kind of as I kind of progressed through, psychology is so broad that I realized that there were other ways of being a psychologist. And for a time I wanted to do forensic psychology. So when I was doing my undergraduate, I did my undergraduate at Warwick Uni, and I started my PhD at Warwick as well. And I was quite determined that I was going to go into forensic psychology. But actually, it was a chance discussion at the end of my undergrad with my dissertation supervisor, sort of saying, have you thought about a PhD? And I think even at that point, sort of 3 years into an undergraduate, I wasn't really aware of what a PhD was, how that was different to kind of being sort of like a professional psychologist. Because obviously, when we think of psychologists, we tend to think of the clinical, the counselling, the forensic, the occupational. But within those kind of chartered psychology roles, you also have academia and research kind of sort of, and you can become a doctor in sort of the research surrounding psychology. And that's essentially what I did. So they said, we've got this PhD, it's in kind of the area of sort of developmental psychology, educational psychology, do you want to apply? I said, don't be ridiculous, there's no way I PhD, especially straight out of an undergraduate. And it was a back and forth of them kind of
Right.
talking me around, and I ended up applying for it, and I got it. I got a studentship to start my PhD at Warwick. So I was, it was a bit of a wiggly journey, but I actually then moved over to Coventry towards the end of my PhD. So I didn't finish my PhD at Warwick. I actually chose to move across to Coventry. So my supervisory team moved here, and I moved with them. And it's interesting that you sort of talk about the research at Coventry, because the reason that they moved was because there was a big collection of sort of literacy and language researchers working at Coventry at the time. And they wanted to join sort of like that area of expertise. And we still have what we call the Centre for Global Learning, Education and Attainment. So I'm sort of affiliated with them still to this day. And yeah, we all sort of moved over, finished off my PhD, and got into research for a bit, and now I'm teaching sort of a few years later. So yeah.
So let me broaden out a little bit, if you don't mind. Why on earth is it important to do research in psychology? Surely it's just about helping people. What's the point of it?
That's again a really good question. So this is something that I always try and explain to sort of
Sure.
not only our applicants but also our students, is that you kind of have two sides of the coin. You either can, I mean, psychology is so broad that you can also go into kind of what we call like psychology informed careers, and there's loads of careers, for example, that
Sure.
I always say there's no career that doesn't involve psychology,
Yeah.
because that human kind of sort of like element is present in everything, even things like AI and computing. I had a lecturer at Warwick who his undergraduate wasn't actually even psychology, it was computer science, but then
Yeah.
his research was in kind of computational models of language learning and those kind of things. So it fit really neatly with that kind of cognitive psychology. But when applicants come in, I think you're right, a lot of them think of sort of like that practitioner
Yeah.
based psychology. So they want to be health psychs, or they want to be clinical counselling psychologists, ed psychs, and they all kind of share this sort of common theme, I suppose, of kind of identifying challenges and then kind of putting in place sort of like remediation, and that's what people tend to think of. But actually, there's a whole other side, which is the research and the academia. And like I said, there's 9 chartered psychology titles that are protected sort of like by the BPS, and some of them obviously can go on to sort of like get further registration with the Healthcare and Professions Council. But the research side of things is kind of, I guess, it underpins and it informs practice, and I think that's why it's so important. So even in COVID, for example, you saw that a lot of the research that went on took place at universities, right? So they trialed the vaccines at universities, and it's the same for psychology and psychological practice as well. So ed psych and educational psychologists work based on the literature that is coming out of academics working at university. So we have to inform that practice, and we have to make it evidence-based. And it's universities that are doing that research. We need to sort of get out there. We need to do what we call primary research, which is where you have a sample, you collect the data and you analyze it in some way, and draw conclusions. And within research, there's many different tiers. It goes from kind of sort of your very quasi-experimental approaches right through to your kind of randomized controlled trials, which is sort of like much kind of like stricter and a sort of like the gold standard of kind of scientific sort of like evidence. But all of it is just really important for informing practice and policy, and we see it all the time.
Sure.
Sorry.
No. I want to split it into two,
Mhm,
like the outcomes. I mean, there's more than two outcomes in research, always. So there's an important principle here about research. Research is there for its own sake. It's not outcome based. I mean, it does have outcomes, of course it does. But research is important. Knowledge is important. That's what makes the human race so special, is our acquisition and sharing of knowledge. And that's why we survived rather than other forms of humans, because we're social in nature and we share stuff.
mhm.
So
Yeah.
that's the assumption of our species survive because we do this sharing of information and knowledge, and so we need to preserve that. I think, as a fundamental principle, that's what gives us the edge, if you like. But let's imagine a simple world in which there are two types of outcomes, which we're going to sort of look at a little bit. One is the sort of clinical outcomes that you said, the research that underpins what's called evidence-based practice, the stuff at the chalk face or the coal face, if you like, that is helping people. And then there's the other bit, which we're sort of probably going to touch on a bit more today, which is the knowledge and evidence that informs policy
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
social and political policy, and
Mhm.
interventions on a broader, more population type scale. Um,
Yes.
let's imagine there's only those two outcomes. No, as you pointed out, there's lots more. So first of all, why is it important to have an evidence base for clinical interventions that help people? Why is that important? I'm sure you could spend 20 years telling me an answer to this, but I'd like you to give me some just headlines as to why you think that's important and the sort of history of psychology. Say, because Jung called himself a psychologist, Freud probably did as well.
Mhm.
They wouldn't be recognizable to us today. Um, but why has it changed? What's important about this research, and why is it evidence-based approaches? Why is it important to understand that?
Mm. I don't know, I think that's a really broad question. Like, why is it important to evidence anything ever at all, I suppose?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
like, I mean, I suppose it's because, to not do so risks getting it wrong, I guess. To sort of to research something gives us potential better informed remediation and intervention, I suppose, like
Yeah.
that we just, wouldn't have unless you'd kind of investigated sort of like the why beforehand. I mean, I think it opens up that question of sort of like, what is that research looking at to start with? And I think even the research itself can be broken down into sort of like that looks at things like, etiology and causes, for example, that is kind of more sort of like theoretical in nature, and that looks at things like interventions and tests, models, and those kind of things. So I think it also can slightly depend on, what it is you're actually looking for. But I suppose broadly speaking, we wouldn't ever want practice or policy to not be evidence, because ultimately it's kind of almost like just, yeah, sort of just grasping in the dark, I suppose,
Sure.
without any
Making
kind of,
stuff up. And sometimes it can work,
yeah.
sometimes it can not. I mean, if we think at the moment, there are figures in the world stage, like in the US, for example, the head of the
Mm.
health services, the political head of health services at the moment is just making stuff up.
Yes, so the classic
It's
one recently was the
anti-scientific.
autism
Yeah,
and paracetamol.
sure.
I had to do, sorry, I always, whenever I start to talk about Trump, I have to kind of like just do a quick scan around, as everybody does, just in case I'm going to get sued or something else is going to sort of like happen. But like yeah, so yeah, one of the classic sort of like I think misrepresentations of kind of research recently was Trump and paracetamol. So I had to do an interview about this, a few months ago, and the problem with that is that again, evidence can be muddy. It can have different outcomes in different contexts. And the thing about the autism and paracetamol sort of like argument is that the evidence itself is very hard to sort of like pick apart, because essentially, cause and effect is really hard to establish. So
Sure.
it's not that we can essentially have pregnant individuals, that we can administer paracetamol to see whether or not there's going to be an impact on their
Yeah, be
unborn child.
unethical.
It's just
That's right. Yeah.
we just can't have that kind of empirical sort of like research. So a lot of the studies are kind of after the fact. So it can be sort of like, parents having to sort of recall whether or not they had treatment, for example, and whether or not that's had an impact. Or it can be maybe they've had paracetamol as part of a medical intervention, for example. Maybe they had an infection, or there's some kind of sort of third variable kind of floating around that actually itself is a bigger predictor of kind of like autism later on. Or the studies themselves, if you actually look at the literature, is quite biased. So they tend to use samples that have a family risk of autism anyway. So there's like a reporting bias there. But unfortunately, what you had on the world stage was somebody kind of taking the kind of overall sort of arching kind of potential message that sort of was like there could be a link, and then kind of almost running with that and kind of
Yeah.
telling everybody that there was. And then you sort of got many different kind of like, health organizations kind of making it very clear to the public that that was not true, that
Yeah.
actually, it's not really a proven association at all. And it's dangerous because essentially it puts a lot of pressure on parents, and the amount of guilt that I imagine that parents might have felt in that moment, hearing some of the comments that came out, like you can take paracetamol, sort of like, but it's your choice, of be it your risk or whatever. It's a horrible position to be in as a parent, particularly if you are a parent of a child who maybe has challenges, maybe has autism, hearing this and this kind of that blame kind of, it
Yeah.
wasn't a nice place to be in. So yes, evidence very important.
And the key word that I heard you use was that word beginning with D, dangerous.
Yes.
That it's dangerous, it is. And autism is an interesting one for a number of reasons. So there's been a bunch of autism scandals from anti-scientific approaches. So even in psychology, we think of Bettelheim, for example, who came up with the theory of the fridge mother causing autism, that it was cold parenting
Yes.
that caused autism, which of course is nonsense, absolute nonsense. And I just want to make that really clear. And research has demonstrated how much nonsense that is, because we now know autism is cross species. And what has human mothering got to do with monkeys having autism? It's like, but only through research can we get that. We then had a British doctor arguing that there was something about vaccines causing autism, which is the classic nonsense. And then we've had this nonsense. Now, the danger is that we cause harm if we don't challenge that nonsense. So, for example, the use of paracetamol in pregnancy is positively indicated to manage temperature problems
Yes,
because that's what
exactly. And
paracetamol is
viral.
there for. It's really good for managing high temperature. If
Hmm.
you've got a cold or a flu,
Yeah.
it's paracetamol is where you go, right?
Quite often used for UTIs as well. So UTIs are incredibly common for sort of like pregnant women. When I had my little girl, I had an emergency C-section, so obviously it was partly kind of sort of pain relief, but I had sort of like constant kind of like sort of UTIs towards kind of like the end of my pregnancy.
Sure.
And I remember having a massive bag of paracetamol drip fed to me post kind of like
Yeah.
C-section, and sort of during, kind of
Yeah.
like labor as well. So, but it was more important to bring my temperature down because that would have had a negative impact on sort of, yeah, my child. So, yeah,
Much
it's
more of a negative impact.
yes,
And
absolutely,
and
yeah.
it's really, and so it is. I mean, I think it's an interesting topic, and it demonstrates why we need. And we sort of, I think it's more urgent these days because we've got these people on the world stage who are anti-science
Yes.
and very damaging because of that. So there's that side of things. So that's about safety. We don't want dangerous practitioners, sort of, and that's what evidence-based practice gives us. It doesn't mean we don't get things wrong, but there's a easier route to putting things right by following a methodology which is based upon evidence. And that evidence builds over time, and then we get to a point where we don't have to prove that the Earth is round anymore. We've evidenced that, and then certain bits of practice now become assumptive. So I no longer think about CBT in the way I had to think about it when I first came across it. Now it's an assumption, and I will automatically get people to change their behavior and do exercise. And I understand it's about lifestyle, and I used to think it was about your childhood experiences. That was my original training, and no longer do I think that. So that's really important, I think, and that we build upon that evidence. The second bit of danger, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on this, is this increasing need to hold practitioners accountable as the field grows, which is great, and more people are providing outside of sort of contained organizations like the NHS or et cetera, much more private practice. It seems to me there is a broad issue about how do the public know that somebody is accountable.
Hmm.
And it's that sort of thing as well. It's like I think if somebody can demonstrate an evidence base, they're more likely to be accountable than if somebody who doesn't, right?
Yeah, I think so. So I don't know whether or not this completely answers your question, but obviously, again, as practitioners, we will be experienced in research in one way or another, even if we don't actually go into sort of like, kind of ed psych practice or clinical counselling. Like there will have been a point in our careers where we would have done our sort of doctoral thesis, we would
Yeah.
have, conducted some kind of research, which I suppose, I mean, we
And in
always
my
say
field, I'm required to continue my professional development, which is
exact, yeah.
constantly staying on top of the research and learning
Mhm.
and growing and developing. And
Yes, and you tend to find that most practitioners, yeah, they'll come in and out of sort of like research. So I've had colleagues who are ed psychs, for example, who have worked in the research centre with us for a bit, and then they've gone back into sort of like working for the local authority or back into sort of like private business and companies, for example. So it's like you said, it's keeping up to date with your knowledge. And we always say in teaching that actually research gives us the authority to teach. And even though I do research still, and I'm still associated with a research centre, I probably don't spend as much time as I would do if my position was a research associate, for
sure.
example. So and that would be my primary role would be research then, with maybe a bit of teaching on the side, whereas my current role is sort of teaching with a little bit of research sort of thing. So but we always say that, yeah, research gives us that authority to teach. And again, as part of my practice, I'm kind of continually sort of keeping up to date. I mean, I'm subscribed to certain sort of like BPS divisions to sort of like get the literature coming through and kind of and it just keeps me a bridge of sort of developments in the field really that I can then make sure our students are the most up to date possible in kind of the content that I'm teaching them.
And as a clinician, and I'm talking specifically as a clinician, what it seems to me is important is that I'm always open to learning something new.
Yeah.
There is a long history in psychological practice in the broadest sense of that word. So it could be psychiatric practice, it could be whatever practice, doesn't mean that broad helping mental health, psychological practice. There's quite a significant amount of practice that has been sort of closed down, shut down, and regressive. And, so it's only fairly recently, for example, that we're understanding that autism presents differently in women, for example. And that's because of the research. And we always thought maybe autism was more about men than women, but it isn't. And same with ADHD, because we're doing the research and we're beginning to understand these things more. I'm just choosing these neurodiversities because they're in the media so much there, but there's a long history of so for example in certain forms of asylums I remember in my early days in learning disabilities, for example, there were a number of women in the asylums I was helping close and move into community care who were there because they had children outside of marriage. They didn't have any learning disabilities at all. But that's where they went, was to this type of hospital. So it's that type of thing. Do you need to, is somebody coming
Oh
in?
no, sorry, I just no, it's absolutely fine. No, carry
All right.
on.
So there's that side of things as well, that we need to be open to learning. I want to switch, if this is all right. I thank you for being so broad and open in allowing me to ask you these major questions about the state of the world. And that's really kind of you to step in. You could just tell me to leave you alone. Um, in terms of like outcomes that are more policy, so that's sort of like I guess people can grasp this research leads to specific types of, you call them remediations or treatments, is probably the word most people would feel resonate with. Remediations is an appropriately academic term. So
I use that term because that's the term I use with my students. So
is it?
because I think as a dev ed psychologist, it's what I teach on, it's what I research around. Intervention to me is such a very specific word. And we tend to say that in psychology, there are certain words that mean very specific things. So intervention has to be something where there's like pre-testing, post-testing, so many
Sure.
weeks, has to be standardized, blah, blah, blah. So I try to say remediation because to me, that captures everything from kind of like digital tools through to teaching strategies through to CBT, whatever it
Absolutely.
is. So
Absolutely. Anything that helps reduce the distress, sort of thing.
yes.
Yeah. Um, into the more broader policy things, which is sort of what the current press release really was about, and it's a sort of hot topic. Research leading to issues around policy, and then we'll talk about the specific research that you're talking about, and how do you see that in terms of the contribution that makes towards I guess making the world a better place. I mean, I have to say that's a really big term and big claim, but I actually do believe it in terms of this. And I think if we make the world a better place from a more informed psychological perspective, it really is getting better as far as I can see. Um,
Yeah.
what's your understanding of research and policy, and sort of how you understand it and what your link to it is?
So I think obviously again, because my area is sort of, educational psychology, we see this a lot. And certainly whilst I've been working in the research centre at Coventry, we've had direct requests, for example,
Yeah.
from sort of like, the Education Endowment Foundation or kind of like, Education England, like different sort of bodies and institutions that again directly approach us to maybe run a scope of the literature or to run certain kind of like research, because the intention is that it then will go on and maybe inform policy. So we tend to see it a lot in education, and we know that the national curriculum is also shaped around things like psychological research. Probably the most classic example that I talk about to my students is things like the phonics screening check, for example. So In the literature, we refer to it as the reading wars, although I don't really like that term, the reading wars, but that is kind of how it's referred to. So for a very long time in education, there was a back and forth between the best way to sort of teach literacy to children.
Yeah.
And I was born in the 80s, grew up in the 90s, so I was very much a product of how it was done and isn't done anymore. So kind of like what we call like the whole word approach. So it was very big in the 90s to kind of step away from this kind of like structured phonics teaching, and to kind of teach more for sort of like motivation and for love of reading. And the whole word approach is where you essentially you teach larger units of the word, and then you sort of break it down into meaning rather than kind of like building it up. Whereas phonics is the opposite way around. It's a bit more arbitrary in that you're teaching sort of direct pairings between the letter sound, the grapheme, the letter itself, those kind of what we call the phoneme grapheme correspondences. And there was a big debate in the literature about which was more effective, these sort of whole word approaches or kind of these more sort of like phonology based approaches. And the literature went sort of like back and forth, and eventually they realized that when they actually looked at these kind of like studies, that children learned best when they had this kind of structured phonics based approach to learning to learn literacy and learning to read, and because of that it then went on to directly shape policy, and they installed the phonics screening check at the end of year 2. So now all children who are taught sort of like in England, sort of like in the UK, have this phonics screening check to see where they are in terms of their letter phoneme grapheme correspondence, their sort of like their letter sound knowledge, all those kind of things. And the outcomes in literacy has sort of increased positively, kind of sort of like exponentially based on this. So I think that's the classic example that I tend to talk to my students about, in terms of like the literature kind of actually the research directly informing practice. But certainly
and then the outcome that people need to understand is that more kids can read better.
Yes,
and that's
because we saw
how important is that, right?
Really, because literacy is everything. So yes, it's super important.
And we have to get that stuff right. I mean, we can't just pin the tail on the donkey, which is what some people would have us do. It needs to be structured testing, and we need the science behind it. We need to understand it, and then we get these outcomes, which our kids it improves their lives.
Yes, absolutely. And literacy is, and I suppose I go on about this a little bit because my area is dev ed, but more specifically it's neurodevelopmental differences, and it's literacy and language development. So language is the key. It's the absolute key to growing a brain. It's what makes us uniquely human. You kind of alluded to it earlier when you talked about us being sort of like social creatures and knowledge gatherers. Like, you're absolutely right. That's what makes us different essentially as a species to a certain extent, and it's this idea of sort of like reciprocal social communication. Yes, we know that other species have social communication, but they don't have language in the same way that we do, and language enables us to think about concepts cognitively and differently to other species. I
mean, I think it's maybe worth hovering around that, because it is the current theory is, why did our type of human survive against, say, Neanderthal? Neanderthal seem to have had bigger brains than us. And isn't it all about bigger brains? Of course. But it isn't necessarily, is it? That isn't what happened. What happened? Why did we survive and Neanderthals didn't? I know you know the answer, so jump in and tell us.
Again, it's a lot about the social communication. So you're right, it's definitely not about the size of the brain. So again, I talk to a lot of our applicants, and we do a lot of sort of like school visits at Coventry, where we have sort of children from the local areas come in and they learn. We make Play-Doh brains. It's really fun. I kind of run these sessions, and we talk about brains and connectivity and neuroplasticity and all these different things in an accessible way. But they're always amazed to kind of understand that it's not about the size of the brain, because we by far do not have the largest brain of all mammal species. I think it's the sperm whale that has the biggest brain, for example. It's not about that. It's how densely connected your brain is and how much kind of activity you have within different sort of processing areas. And there are even some mammals that have more densely connected neural cortexes than us. So like the dolphin, for example, they have a very big sort of like neural cortex, and it's arguably kind of like bigger and more densely connected than ours. So there's some school of thought that sort of suggests that dolphins, actually potentially are more intelligent, and they certainly have this kind of sort of reciprocal social communication as well. We tend to find that species that engage more in what we call social cooperation tend to be more intelligent than sort of like other species. So again, you see it in sort of like some of the kind of like primate species. But yeah, I think there's probably many reasons why. I'm definitely not an anthropologist, so I can't give you a specific answer about Neanderthals versus kind of like Homo sapiens, kind of like so on and so forth. But a lot of it was to do with language. And a lot of it was to do with things like our larynx being different. And again, that sort of descended as we kind of became kind of like bipedal. Is that the right kind of like words? We kind of like, we stood up, our larynx descended. It gave us more variation in like the vocalizations that we could produce. And I think because of that, it then opened up again, our sort of cognitive perception of the world. If you have more terms for things and you can describe things in more clarity, then you can think about things in more clarity. Yeah. And it's kind of as simple as that. That's why language is the absolute key.
And then there's the interesting things like mirror neurons and all that sort of stuff.
Yes.
And if I can think, then you can think, because we can share that and I can activate it in you. And part of the theory of why psychotherapy works, for example, is that sort of stuff. The strange situation of the brain. So let's move it again. I mean, it's lovely talking to you. I'm really enjoying this conversation. I'm like, there's so many rabbit holes here that are so fascinating that I just want to dive into, but I'm having to sort of pull myself away from them. Now we come to the sort of matter at hand, which is the research around screen time and children, and social media in general. I guess I might ask you about that more generally. And I was talking last night with an LBC presenter, Ben Kentish, about some research. It's probably not the good word for it, but then one of the teaching unions has done a survey of teachers and are concerned about the exposure on social media sites to extremism, particularly misogyny, which we know is an issue. And so broadly, we're talking about those types of issues. Specifically, you've been looking at things like screen time, which I know that teaching unions in particular have been concerned that screen time has reduced literacy rates. And so I don't know if you can talk about that, but tell us a bit about the research around screen time and the sort of issues that you're seeing, and we'll maybe have a slightly broader conversation about screens, social media, this new age that we're in that's not going away, and how do we understand it, the benefits and the costs, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a big topic. So I think there's lots of research that kind of looks at how screens impact sort of like human development. And I think we have to be careful because we have to sort of break it down sort of incrementally, because essentially, and this is probably a bit of one of the issues I've kind of had with the guidance that's come out recently about kind of like the reducing the screen time sort of like to an hour for kind of like under fives, and sort of like no time alone for kind of like under twos, is that they've spoken about the research on screen time quite holistically and as if it's kind of homogenous almost, but it's not. And this is a problem because screen use is very heterogeneous. To have a child on a screen for an hour doing a maths game, for example, is very different to having a child look at a phone screen and scroll, or doom scroll as they call it, on social media for an hour.
I'll give a slightly more extreme example, if you like. The Veterans Association, which treats in America, treats people who have been in the armed forces and have physical health problems or psychological health problems. They've been looking at screens and games as a way of managing chronic pain, to reduce opiate use. So, of course, we can't be simplistic about this. And if we can reduce opiate use to manage chronic pain, that's a big boon to the world, to be honest. And that really is. That would be a super breakthrough. So I just want to reinforce what you're saying. We have to have a complex conversation about this, not a simplistic conversation. So.
Yes, absolutely. And you're right. I've got a colleague who, I'm sure she won't mind me name dropping her, but Jodie Raybould, her research is all around sort of like gaming and the positive kind of like implications of it. And it can
I'm a great fan of that research. I think there's a lot of really positive stuff happening in that field.
There is, and I think again, I mean, again, my area and Jodie's area is also a lot to do with sort of like neurodiversity, and
Sure.
again, we know that if you have one child who has attention challenges and they don't want to attend to maths lessons, but they will attend to a maths-based game, what are you going to do? You're obviously going to sort of offer it them kind of like on a screen, because we know that children with ADHD tend to gravitate slightly to more towards screens. So it's kind of I suppose what I wanted to stress is that screens themselves aren't inherently bad. Technology itself isn't inherently bad. It's got plenty of positive applications. It's what it can replace sometimes that I think is where it becomes
Yes.
problematic. And what I tend to sort of try to communicate is that one of the biggest problems that we have with screens and screen usage is that it replaces kind of, again, this sort of reciprocal oral language communication. It doesn't necessarily have to be oral language. It could be things like sign language. But studies show that if you have a child who's on a screen, their parents and their carers will talk less to them. It's the same with things like talking tech as well. So if you have children who are playing with like the VTech type toys, and they actually,
Can I just give
sorry.
people a bit of background knowledge as to why that is significant, right?
Mhm.
So there were studies around, you'll know these, the studies around language acquisition in the first 2 years of life. We don't learn language, we acquire it by being in an environment that communicates to us. And there were some case studies looking at, for example, multilingual children that became multilingual because they might have had a parent who was bilingual, but also by listening to the radio.
Yeah.
And we're picking up language from listening to the radio. So this lack of communication, and you mean language in the broadest sense. I know why you bring sign
Yeah.
language into it, because it's a true language. So it's not just oral. So sign language, for people don't know, is a visual language, but it is a language. It has its own grammar, its own phonemes, its own graphemes, its own structure. Slightly different to spoken language, but actually in some ways more advanced, I think, from my sort of experience of it. So um, so being in if you like, a linguistic, oral,
Language
linguistic,
rich.
visual, language rich,
Yeah.
beautifully, thank you. In a language rich environment is essential,
Yes.
absolutely essential. And children that cannot access a language rich environment, there is the classic study of that poor girl in California who was locked in a basement. The
Genie.
impact, Gina,
Yeah.
that one, it's dreadful, horrific,
Yeah.
what happened to her. But the impact upon being languageless is really quite significant to a human, right?
Yes.
It's important to say that. So if anything
Yes.
is taking language out of a child's environment, that's got to be considered a high risk activity, I think. Would you agree?
Yes, absolutely. So it's because of what we call essentially like a Matthew effect or a snowball effect. So essentially, the more exposure a child has to what we call reciprocal communication, and this is why I wanted to stress that it's not just about oral language, because obviously you may have listeners who themselves may be deaf. They may have deaf children, for example. When you look at the research, it's not necessarily about the actual words that are spoken as such. It's about the reciprocal turn taking. So turn taking is where someone sort of says or signs something, then the other person kind of sort of like either listens or kind of like sort of what watches, understands, comprehends what they've been asked, and then formulates an answer and sort of like signs or says it back. So
Yeah.
that kind of turn
Peekaboo,
taking
language
back and
games,
forth,
those early developmental things. So yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's the absolute rocket fuel essentially for growing a brain and for cognitive development. And the reason that it's so
Say that
important,
again. I want people to hear that.
oh, sorry, it's the
That's
rocket fuel
the
for growing the
absolute rocket
brain.
fuel for growing. That's a brilliant way
Yes,
of saying it.
yes. Well, we always say in child development, one of the best things that you can do when a child is sort of picking up language is if they ever point at something, when they're in that kind of sort of proto-imperative kind of like when they're doing that pointing behavior,
Cool.
is you recognize it as soon as possible
Yeah.
and you name what it is that they're pointing at.
Right.
Because in that moment, that magical little moment, you've got that joint attention and that opportunity to learn. Essentially, they're pointing, they want to know what is that, and you say, oh, it's a cat or it's a bird, and it's like a rocket fuel for sort of like, yeah, putting that
And that
piece of
produces
information.
hormonal responses in the brain of the infant, which produce myelination,
Yes.
the neurological structures themselves. So it's absolutely crucial, isn't it? Right.
It's really important. And basically, this idea of a snowball effect or like a Matthew effect is this idea that basically the more language, we'll just say, language you're exposed to before the age of 3 essentially is supposed to predict how well you do basically for the rest of your life. So
Yeah.
there are many classic studies that have kind of looked at it. Yes, they're slightly controversial. They're kind of like the Risley and the Hart kind of like studies. But the idea is that the richer the language environment, the more of these reciprocal kind of turn-taking events that a child is exposed to, the better then their understanding will be of things like speech sounds and phonology, grammatical structures, social conventions, all those kind of things. The better understanding they have of that, then the better access they have to literacy, because literacy is very much predicted by our oral language kind of, or our language understanding first, because we first develop language, then we develop literacy. Literacy is after our sort of exposure to language. So once we have a better sort of understanding and proficiency in literacy, we have better access to education. Better access to education is better access to jobs, job prospects, salaries, money. So, and those original studies that again are, slightly controversial now, went as far to say that you can directly predict somebody's salary, their eventual salary, based on how rich their language environment was before the age of 3. So,
Right.
it's incredibly important for many different things, even if it's not.
And I would say also from a psychological perspective, even if somebody doesn't get the money, the richness inside your own head is absolutely the most important wealth that exists, I think, in my experience.
Yeah.
And this is fundamentally allows people to form complex social connections to other people. And that's the core of psychological health, really, is that network as well as other things. But that capacity to allow your brain and your mind to grow in connection with other human beings that's where the gold seam is, really.
Yes, absolutely. And again, it comes down to this idea that I think, our conscious perception is impacted by our language proficiency as well, to a certain
It really
extent.
is, yeah,
So,
absolutely. I think that's right. And the way we can represent internally, and
mhm,
communicate, and understand the representations in other people that they have of
yeah.
themselves.
Mhm,
So, we've made it complicated, which is great because does need to be complex and complicated.
mhm.
What is the message though that you're saying about the research specifically in terms of screen time and what's happening?
Yeah.
A lot of
So,
parents and educators, a lot of people are just like, I need to understand this stuff. There's so many, we got these court cases in America, we got this, we got that, So tell us what your research is telling you.
yeah. So, again, I think, research is essentially saying that we know that screens have a big impact on several different areas. So everything from kind of sort of like understanding oral language through to kind of like later literacy, because it's so, kind of based on sort of early language exposure, right through to things like processing and also emotional regulation. So I think one of the things that the guidance hasn't done very well is that they've kind of almost alluded at these different concepts without actually kind of explaining the why to parents and carers
Okay.
and practitioners. So one of the things, for example, they've said is, if you have a child under 2, they shouldn't be watching a screen on their own. The reason that they've said that is because, research shows that the best way to digest sort of like visual information and TV shows and those kind of things is if you're sitting with others, where you can do things like discuss the narrative, explain cause and effect, talk about consequences, use as a shared learning sort of experience, and again, increase that oral language. And I think if the government had maybe sort of said, well, this is what you need to do, but also this is the why, then I think it might have had a bigger impact on things like behavior change. And I think, as psychologists, we know that the why is really important.
Yeah,
And again, they sort of
absolutely,
but
absolutely, without
didn't
a
really
doubt.
say
Yeah,
why.
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, things like emotional regulation is a big one. So we know that, children, they if they watch, I think it's about 4 to 7 minutes of fast-paced sort of like TV or content, it can impact their executive functioning, processing, and emotional regulation for about 20 minutes afterwards,
Yeah.
as a minimum. The problem that we have as well is things like social media, so your TikToks and your scrolls, they're so addictive that they kind of, you put them down okay, so you've started the clock again now. Your processing isn't going to be, tip top for 20 minutes. But what do we do before that 20 minutes is up? We've probably picked it back up again.
So can we come back to this word addictive? I think it's really important. I think from a internal neurological perspective, I think what you're saying is dopamine. They're dopamine
Yes.
based.
Yeah.
Can you describe that, what that means? Because I think the word addictive and addicted, etc., it's an important word. It's an
Mhm.
important word, and there's increasing research showing that these dopamine pathways are similar to drug use pathways, which are just simply hijacking of other pathways in the brain. Anyway,
Yeah.
which is why they're sort of valued, but we'll go into that broader conversation. So tell me about dopamine addiction and your understanding it from a sort of neuroscientific, neurological perspective.
Yeah, so I think thank you for pulling me up on that, because I think you're right. I think I probably threw in the word addictive there without maybe probably sort of like qualifying it, because I think when we talk about addictive sort of like behaviors, there's a big difference between having substances that are kind of very sort of like physiologically, physically addictive, kind of like
Sure.
alcohol, and it having kind of like a wider sort of scope of kind of like withdrawal effects, versus something that is maybe kind of more psychologically addictive. And I think when you talk about things being psychologically addictive, it's often because the behavior itself produces these quite pleasant neurotransmitters, one of them being dopamine, for example, which is your reward based sort of like processing kind of like neurotransmitter. So whenever we complete a task, we get a shot of dopamine.
Yeah.
Makes us feel quite good, makes us feel quite happy and elevated, makes us happy. It's like a happy kind of like sort of like chemical. We get it for other reasons as well. So we get it again when we kind of like, make strong sort of like social bonds. We also can get it from kind of, obviously certain substances. I'm sure that I read that cheese can give you a spike in dopamine, I
I've
think.
heard that, and I've always wondered
Yeah,
why I have
I
a
don't know.
personal addiction to cheese.
It
I've got
might
I've got a
explain why.
block of it ready to be eaten later.
Yeah, I don't know how. I mean, there's probably some nutritionists that like, yeah, might be able to sort of clarify that better in the comments or whatever. But yeah.
But
Mm,
dopamine is central in a lot of things. So lack of dopamine
yes.
is in certain neurological disorders. So, for example, L-DOPA is a form of dopamine that was created. If people want to know about it, go and watch the film Awakenings. It's brilliant. It'll tell you a lot about dopamine and what it does. And lack of
Mm,
dopamine is a problem. Um,
yes.
but also artificially generating dopamine. What's your thoughts on that? Because dopamine is such a crucial thing in terms of motivation. It's a
Yeah.
signaler that we've had enough. If it doesn't work, if you're like in the brains of addicts, the D2 receptors don't work so well. So there's no cut-off switch. That's what's
Mhm.
happening. The levels rise, but they don't notice, so they carry on. What's your views from what you understand of this artificial generation of dopamine? Is it a significant problem? Is it just because it's distracting us because we want to go back to the machine that made us feel good? Is there a state of play in the evidence around that yet, do you think?
Um, yeah, I'm not sure. So, I mean, I will admit that I'm not a neuroscientist as such, and this is
Okay.
probably kind of like venturing slightly outside of my area of expertise. But I think a lot of the way that the algorithms are developed today means that you feel like essentially you have almost completed a task by almost digesting different parts of
Right.
the social
That's
media.
what I understand it to be. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I think it's that, you watch a short video, you scroll past a few things, it's almost like you completed a thing. And again, it's not, you've got to think that this is where it comes back to like the heterogeneity of sort of like screen use, because very different apps are very different. Certain apps, for example, give you things like daily goals and targets, like Snapchat, I think gives you like, you get like streaks and stuff, for example, that
Yeah.
you have to take a photo so many often. So you feel like you're achieving something. And we tend to, so for things like for ADHD, for example, there are theories that kind of underlie sort of ADHD things like that are kind of dopamine based. So things like sort of like delay aversion and different kind of like dopamine based theories that basically say individuals with ADHD will try and complete smaller tasks because they're quicker and you get that sort of hit of dopamine quicker,
Yeah.
rather than kind of thinking about that big longer task, which is that we then tend to try and put off because it's like harder to do. So what our brain quite often does is that you'll sit down, you've got a ton of emails to get through, a ton of work. What's a quicker dopamine fix? picking up the phone,
That's,
scrolling
I mean,
through,
that seems to
doing what.
me that's what's being communicated is that
Hmm.
distractibility because we've got a difficult task in front of us, which is to learn calculus, which I never
Hmm.
learned, I have to say. But let's say you are younger and you're at school and you're being forced to learn calculus. That's quite a difficult thing to do, and you won't get the reward necessarily that quickly.
Yeah.
And if you unconsciously know or habitually know that there's a reward in your phone,
Yes.
watching a video which
Hmm.
somebody else is making money out of, but you don't know that it's not why you're watching it, you might turn towards that. That seems to be what's being said at the moment, and that
Yes.
habits is problematic. It's interfering with child development, right?
It is, and I think this is why a lot of the big companies are, being scrutinized now because essentially they're developing apps that play into this, and they're not they've done it, with again comes back to this idea that there's no career that psychology doesn't sort of like kind of like apply to. They have psychologists, they have people working that help inform these kind of things because essentially if you know how the brain works and you know how to capture its attention, and one of the things that you can do is stuff like having content that very much sort of speaks to an individual. So the algorithm, for example, will kind of like reinforce certain beliefs. For example, it will show you content that's very relevant to you. It will also do things like quite often like will give you little rewards, like kind of like sparkly animations or flashes or those kind of things that again is pleasant for us to see. And it becomes addictive. One of my favorite ones to think about is stuff like, it's gone a bit out of fashion now, but do you remember Candy Crush as a
Yes,
game?
I never played it, but yes, I remember it.
I never played it, but there was some like talk around that being incredibly addictive. But one of the reasons is because essentially you've got all these big, bright, colourful kind of like sort of candies dropping, and then once you get a line, it sort of like flashes, it sparkles, you get points, it feels like you've achieved something. But also the colours themselves are very much kind of like based on the colours that we tend to be attracted to. So sort of like those bright fruit type colours, so like the reds, the yellows, the oranges, that again, once upon a time would have been incredibly adaptive for us to sort of seek out in our
Yes,
environment
absolutely. Yeah,
and to consume,
yeah.
but not so much now, kind of thing. Well, obviously, it's still important to eat fruit and veg, but kind of like we didn't have a kind of an attentional
We're
bias
not having
towards
to
it
hunt
now.
through the
Mm.
supermarket shelves for it. It's just laid
Pretty
out.
much.
That's
But
right.
we still have this inbuilt attentional
Sure.
bias for these kind of colours. And what these app developers have done is that they've kind of almost capitalized on that. They know that. And then they create apps that sort of use these psychological principles to kind of draw us in. And I heard a quote once, then it was something like, attention is the most sought after commodity now that, any company can kind of like
Yeah,
vie for.
absolutely. They've
And
monetized it completely. Yeah, that's right.
and that's what's
Absolutely.
happened.
So we're sort of running out, we have run out of time. We've gone way over, in fact, but that's fine because there's been so many interesting rabbit holes to sort of go and have a look at. I guess if I was to try and sum up what you're saying is it's really important to educate yourself on why certain things exist, to learn about it and make informed decisions and not have a black and white simplistic approach, and to try and understand something about why something might be damaging is because it's taking away an essential skill from a child, but that
Mhm.
doesn't, it's not because of the screen, it's
Yes.
because of the activity and the way the activity is framed. But actually, there can be really positive outcomes as well. Um,
Yes.
I
So
always say,
that's
I mean, parents often will contact me and say, should I stop my kid from using this or that? And I'm more likely to say, no, I think what you need to do is engage with them and learn and understand it,
yeah.
and then make informed decisions with your kid about that.
Yes. So I think that's something that I definitely wanted to try and get across. So I was listening to a radio show. I won't name whose radio show or which presenter it was, but they made the comment along the lines of, do we think we'll get to this point where people will feel that they've got a social responsibility to stop children on screen? So say you're sitting on a train, you see a parent and
Right.
the child is on a screen, and we'll get to this point where we're encouraging each other to be like, you shouldn't do that with your kids, kind of thing. And they actually likened it to smoking, which really frustrated me. So they sort of said, oh, if you saw someone letting their child smoke, you'd probably step in and stop them. do we get to this point where we do the same with screens? And I kind of thought to myself, that completely misses the point, because
It does.
smoking's not bad for you because it takes oxygen out of your lungs. Smoking is bad for you because it puts carcinogenic things into your lungs. Screens, obviously, they can have negative content on them. Of course they can, but that's not the reason that they're bad. And, it's because essentially, and again, they're not inherently bad. There's loads of positive applications. It's because it reduces things like the language rich environment. And that's, again, crucial for growing a brain. It also doesn't really help with things like emotional regulation, because we know that children can become dysregulated from watching these kind of very fast-paced kind of like sort of TV content type shows or reels or whatever it is, or fast-paced games. And in a world where there is lots of dysregulation going on anyway, it's problematic if you potentially have a child sort of constantly exposed to that, both in sort of like a 3D environment and also a 2D environment. They're not getting that kind of respite. The world is very different now to how it was 50
Yeah,
years ago, sort of thing.
absolutely.
But I guess what I really wanted to make clear is that, if you do use screens, and I absolutely use screens with my 7-year-old, even though this is my area of research,
Yeah.
she does go on a screen, because at the end of the day, you have no there are so many positive applications, and you have no idea why that parent or that child may be on a screen. Because again, if you think about things like neurodevelopmental differences, it could be that child needs that screen to regulate. Children with autism, for example, quite often use screens, headphones, music, whatever it is, to
Absolutely. To
regulate as that
reduce
simple
the overwhelm,
sense. Yeah,
absolutely. Without
imagine being
a
on a really busy hot train. You've got
Yeah,
people
without a
around
doubt.
you, all these
No.
things going on, and you need that. And then, even from my own personal experience, like, I actually have a panic disorder, which I don't mind talking about, but I find it particularly difficult to travel.
Yeah.
Airports, for example, when I go away, I let my little girl have a screen during that wait time, because she's 7, and if that she didn't have a screen, she would want my full attention, and she'd want to be playing. And
Yeah.
of course, I try. We do some crosswords, we do some reading, but I'm feeling so anxious in that moment that I just need her to be occupied and happy, and not herself dysregulated, so that I can focus on myself. So I do hope we never get to a point where people are policing other people's screen use. And really, the message is, again, that it's not that screens are inherently bad, but it can take away all of those really useful brain growing activities like language.
So we have to grow around that use, I guess, and our understanding,
Mhm.
and incorporate it in healthy, positive, pro-social ways. So, Kat, it's been super to have you on. Thank you so much. It's
Yeah.
really exciting to hear about the work and to be able to share it with the public. And like I say, folks, if there's stuff that you want to know more about, do send me a message. 07 506 319 745. I don't think I said that at the beginning, but that's my WhatsApp number. So happy to hear from you. If you've got questions for Kat, I'll pass them on to her. We'll circle back and get you back next time you're producing some more research for us. It's been really, really informative and really sort of fun to chat. And who knew that research and dry, boring psychological research is actually quite interesting and fun. And
I would never call it dry, boring. Like, it's so important. The human experience is everything. So yeah.
absolutely, well said. All right, well, on that super note, we're going to leave it there, and I'll see you all at the next show. You stay there, Kat. It's been lovely to have you on. I hope you all enjoyed it. Do give me your feedback, and I'll see you at the next episode of the Wellbeing Show. So bye bye for now.